So, good morning, everyone. Today we are going to have a presentation from Professor Giordano. It's a great pleasure for us, California State University's Bay, to have James Giordano talking about neuroethics. Today he's a specialist in many areas. Here I read the books he wrote, and we have a wide range on chronic pain medicine, or bottle escape brain. He gave. He wrote and gave presentations on a wide range of studying. I have the great pleasure to have you here. He's going to present to my class on bioethics, but also to the wider audience who had the graciousness to be here today. So the floor is all yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Professor. That's very, very kind. And hopefully everyone can hear me just fine. So we had a little bit of problem with the mainframe computer, but we can adapt and we can conquer. And so I appreciate the offer. I'm very, very grateful for your invitation to present not only to your class, but to a wider audience. As you heard in my introduction, I'm a neuroscientist and also work as a neuroethicist. My position at Georgetown is as a professor in the Department of Neurology and Biochemistry, but I'm also chief of the Neuroethics Studies program in the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics, among other things. I also serve as the chief bioethicist for the Defense Medical Ethics Center here in Washington, D.C., and I've had the wonderful opportunity of working with my international colleagues, not only in Italy, mostly in Trento, in Bolzano, but also I'm a visiting professor in Germany, where I've been for the past 11 years. My background is a bit different in that I was trained both as a neuroscientist and also as a philosopher and as an ethicist. When I got into the field of neuroscience, the titular field called neuroscience, that was about 41 years ago. And when I tell people that, I have to shake my head because I don't believe I'm that old, but I guess there's enough gray in my beard and there's no hair in my head, so that's fine. The field of neuroscience as a titular field actually came into being in the late 1970s. I was fortunate enough to get in early on that, if you will, growing wave of interest in this new field called neurosciences. But I think there's a misnomer there. Let me sort of take away that misnomer. The fact that there is a titular field called neurosciences that was, if you will, birthed in the late 1970s in no way suggests that there was not an interest in studying the brain before that. In fact, I would posit to you that ever since humanity first looked in some reflecting pool, centuries and centuries, not eons ago, and what looked back at them was their own image, and they recognized, this is me, that began a train of thought. Well, how is it that I recognize me? How is it that I'm thinking this? How is it that thought occurs? Do other people feel the same way I do, think the same way I do? And what about other organisms, animals, plants? And if we look back literally to the ancients, if we look not only in Western literature, but also in Asian literature, we can see that there were musings, both philosophical as well as in some cases mathematical, on what it means to be. I mean, if we look to the classical works, for example, of Aristotle, Lucretius, Galen, and we come through the ages and make centenary gaps, for example, up to the Middle Ages, probably most notably, here's the work of the mathematician and philosopher Rene Descartes. We come to Rene Descartes' primary work, the cogito. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But as simple as a statement that is, let's peel back that first layer of what is its apparent truthfulness. If I'm thinking, therefore I must exist. But there are some corollary questions. Does everything that exists think? Is thinking, therefore, the necessary requisite to existing, to being whatever one is, a person, a human person, an animal person? And how is it that I think? How is it that this gray stuff in my head produces this great stuff of my thoughts, my emotions, my behavior? How is it that literally everything that I am, the entity of me, my embodied self, is a consequence of the interaction between that body, this brain, and my ecology, my environment. Let's jump forward. As we see the march of the first industrial revolution, the rise of science, ultimately the second industrial revolution, the technologization of much of science and medicine, we developed tools that allowed us to iteratively explore our theories about what it means to have a brain and perhaps be a mind. And as we come to the turn of the last century, the early 1900s, certainly we can see the rise of pharmacological agents, surgical agents that allowed us to probe deeply into the living brain and explore the connectivities that exist between its structure and the functions of thought, feelings, and actions. And then, of course, as we move through the 20th century, I think arguably we can call the 20th century the century of technology. If previous centuries evidenced the rise of science as discrete disciplines, then certainly the use of tools to deepen that science was the hallmark of the 20th century. And not all of those tools were used for what universally might be construed as good. We can see the mechanization, for example, of warfare, and as a consequence of that, the equal mechanization of medicine to care for those things that we can, in fact, injure. Our healing and our helping perhaps going hand in hand as part of the same phase. But this also, if you will, bespeaks a different dance, something of a more intellectual, a heuristic tango, if you will. The tango that exists between the tools we have at our disposal and the theories that we create. And we come to the limits of those theories, and very often what that does is that dictates, that obligates us to make tools anew. And what do we do with those tools? Well, humans are tool users. I mean, other species are too. I mean, that's undeniable. But I think humans have ascended to the top, if you will, of our evolutionary ziggurat, at least on this planet, through the use of tools. And what we use our tools to do is not only assess the natural world, but to access and affect the natural world. And the brain is no different. Our tools of assessment of the brain allow us to access the brain at a variety of levels, literally from the social all the way down to the subcellular, and then back again. And accessing the brain allows us to affect the brain on each and all of those levels. And when we affect the brain, we affect those things that the brain does. Our thought, our feelings, our actions as individuals, as communities, as groups, as people, as organisms, different organisms, and perhaps our ability to relate to each other as humans and to other organisms, and maybe even to the tools themselves, be they machines, and those machines then enabling us to interact with each other, and the machine itself, brain-machine interfaces, BMIs. Well, let's fast forward yet again. Let's fast forward now to the 1970s and this concatenation of disciplines, not only in the sciences, but also in humanities. I mean, literally all the sciences came together within this field called neurosciences. The physical sciences, engineering, physics, chemical sciences, natural sciences, life sciences, social sciences, trying to address the perdurable questions that humanity has thrown down since, as we said, humanity first looked in some reflecting pool and recognized this is us. What is mind? What is self? What is the nature of mind and self? What is the connection between brain, body, brain, self and others? Is there perdurable consciousness? We still struggle with these issues. And although the brain sciences have provided us increasingly more complicated, more granular and finite information, what the philosopher David Chalmers refers to as the hard question. In other words, what is consciousness? How does brain occur in mind? Still remains beyond our grasp. Well, that doesn't stop our reach any. We may not be able to grasp this, if you will, efficient causality of how brain and mind interact and how mind and brain may supervene. But we still keep reaching for ever more sophisticated tools to assess on a variety of levels and to affect on a variety of levels. And this brings us to the contemporaneity of this field that we now refer to as a sort of concatenator, or conjoined field. That field being neuroscience and technology, very often abbreviated as neuro, S&T, neuroscience and technology. And there is this sophisticated dance. And in many ways, I liken it to a tango. I mean, for those of you who may do Argentine tango, you know that clearly, culturally, the male partner, the traditional male partner leads. But really the male partner does very little. It's the female partner that makes him look so good on the floor. Well, what does that mean then for this dance between tools and theory? Who's making who look good? Who's doing what? Who's leading? There is no lead. It's a reciprocity of lead. We sharpen our theories, revise our theories because of the tools we have at hand. Those tools provide our limits and our delimits. But the question then becomes, what do we do with those tools and how do we use them? So let me briefly provide for you an overview of the tools we have right now in our armamentarium, in our tool belt, in our toolkit, in our box of tools of the brain sciences. Well, what does that essentially mean for us? Well, what we have at our armamentarium at this point is we have three basic categories of tools. We have our tools of neuroscientific and neurological assessment, such things as biomarkers that being collected from the periphery, genetics and genomics, physiological and electrophysiological indicators, and increasingly the use of ever more sophisticated co-registered types of brain imaging to peer into the living brain, not just to freeze it in a point in time, but to use relatively real-time analyses to map and model the brain on a variety of levels. Again, from the synaptic and the cellular all the way to the way that those synapses and those cells in my brain, in this body, allow me to interact with my psychosocial environments. But then we have the tools of intervention, because if we can assess it and we can access it, we can affect it. These tools include, are limited to, developments in pharmacology. And yeah, humans are fairly comfortable with drugs, better living through chemistry, as the 20th century adage goes. And I, having grown up during the 1960s and 1970s, can tell you that the use of neuro and psychotropic drugs was not just confined to the clinic, but very often gained wide public availability and convenience. And as a consequence of this, what we're finding is that we understand a bit more about the way the brain works and how drugs can affect, or in some cases, misaffect the brain. But I don't care how sophisticated those drugs are. Drugs are what we call dirty. In other words, a single drug can act in a number of different places in the brain. And when it comes to acting in the brain, ladies and gentlemen, it's all about the real estate. The brain is just a collection of nodes and networks that work in very, very rapid time across large areas of its surface in almost instantaneity. So a drug that modifies a chemical in one place may do one thing, and changes in nodes and networks up or downstream may do something else. So what drugs tend to lose is their stereospecificity. In other words, we're kind of still buckshotting rather than sharpshooting with our drugs, but we can get them where they need to go because we can modify the drugs. We can link the drugs to technologies such as nano-engineered devices that we can then utilize various forms of electromagnetic current to guide directly where we want it to go to the brain, to use ultra small doses of drugs, far more sharpshot than buckshot. We can also use various forms of electrical and magnetic stimulation, sometimes by stimulating the peripheral nervous system to then get a central effect, other times by attempting to stimulate the central nervous system and brain directly, either utilizing magnetic stimulation or electrical stimulation through very, very low doses of currents. These are respectively referred to as transcranial magnetic stimulation and transcranial direct current or alternating current electrical stimulation. But you know, the problem with those things is that they're, I'm not going to say crude, but they're literally superficial. I mean, in most people, they have to go through some hair, but at the very, very least, they have to go through scalp. And then underneath the scalp, there's fascia and muscle and then bone, and then there are layers of protective tissue. And then they get the home run and hit the brain. But by that point, the diffusion of magnetic or electrical current only allows us superficial activity at those uppermost levels of the brain surface, which, while certainly important because there's high connectivity, those things that are on the upper levels of the brain's outer surface are certainly connected with what lies below. But we lose precision. We don't have to. We also have something called deep brain stimulation that has been used literally for decades, mostly to treat movement disorders such as dystonia, essential tremor, and Parkinson's, but increasingly being used in a wider variety of interventions to treat not only the movement disorders, but other neurodegenerative neurological disorders and psychiatric disorders as well, with far more precision and far more specificity, utilizing much more detailed, finer electrodes that have much greater control, not only in being able to direct current discretely within small areas of the brain, but also to record from the brain. In other words, create a closed loop system. Literally, a human-machine interface that's indwelling it, and we're moving more and more towards non-surgical or minimally surgical approaches that can now utilize remote access to the brain to literally read from the living brain and write into the living brain in real time remotely. Each and all of these techniques and technologies are being capacitated by the use of big data that allows us to go across a variety of scales and levels and understanding the human person and other organisms, as we said before, and those scalar levels that include the cellular and subcellular, all the way to the way we socio-psychologically and economically and politically interact. Well, what does that mean for us? Well, what that means is data are ubiquitous. How do we handle data? Well, we've taken that step as well. We're using more and more decision technologies. That's a fancy way of saying forms of artificial intelligence. And all of that's becoming seamless. Not only is it becoming seamless, it's global. The United States is not the only nation to devote billions of its assets towards studying the brain and what it does. There are numerous international programs with such high levels of fiscal devotion. In Europe, for example, it's the Human Brain Project, China Brain Project, Japan Brain Mind Project, Australia New Zealand Brain Project, Brain Argentina, Brain Project Brazil. Here in the United States, the Brain Initiative, Brain Research to Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. But what becomes important to understand is the multinationality of the effort. Why? Well, simple. Because nations are the nexus, the locus, the expression for cultures. Cultures aren't uniform. And although I'd love to think that what neuroscience may teach us is what we have in common and perhaps what we have in difference, what we certainly do know is that cultures have different histories, and those histories are complete with differing needs, values. And those needs and values then give rise to different philosophies, and those philosophies not only describe their anthropologies, but also their ethics. And when you have differing ethics, you have differing levels of permissivity and constraint. The question then becomes, well, which one is right? Which one is wrong? Which one is good? Good for whom? To paraphrase the philosopher Alistair McIntyre, which good? Whose rationality? What justice? So what we can see is that on a very simple level, although we like to believe, and I think defensively we can assert that the driving force behind so much of scientific and technological development, neuroscience and neurotechnology no different, is striving for the good. We have to ask, who's good? And is my good, in fact, equally good for you? Even what appears to be usurpation of science and technology into those agendas that are known as dual use, military use. One might think that's heinous, that's the dark side. Wait a minute, show me a group of people that has gone off to war thinking what they're doing is intrinsically bad or evil. Armies march off to war believing their cause is just, defending their ideals, their way of life. In an open society, that's politics defending its polis through armed force. So the question then becomes, how do we define good? How do we define what right use is? And how do we deal with this ever more on a multinational, diversified, global 21st century stage? This brings us squarely to the interface of not only neuroscience and technology, but the ethical, legal, and policy issues that are necessary to guide it, to be prepared for it, to use it and use it in ways that are, quote, good, to understand what the good is, and then to govern it in those instances where perhaps those goods vary substantially enough to create problems. Not an easy task. If we were to break down the ethical, legal, and social issues that arise from the brain sciences, they would be categorically in two major areas that, again, are not mutually exclusive. First, those that are intrinsic to the science and technology, And as I just finished telling you, this is new science, this is new tech, and the technology is evolving and emerging literally in a rapid 5-year cycle of construct to capability. Brain science moves fast, moves quickly from bench to the bedside and beyond. And as a consequence of that, I think one of the things that becomes important to understand is what are going to be the intermediate and long-term effects of the science and technology itself, predicated upon the first point that I made, that we really don't completely understand how this thing called mind occurs in the brain. And it may very well be that these tools and techniques help us to formalize, ratify, and validate these theories, but we won't know that until we get there. And what do we do in between? We don't have 30, 40 years, 50 years experience of putting these newly developed devices, techniques, and approaches into people's heads. And then you get the intersection of unknowns. We think we know what the science and technology does because we think we know how the brain works, but we're using the science and technology to further explore the brain, and we're intervening in the interim, and therefore those unknowns intersect. Unanticipated side effects, unanticipated main effects, runaway effects, not only with regard to the runaway of the technology, but perhaps running away out of the technological sphere into the social sphere. Because although we like to think that what we're going to use these science and technological approaches for, doing things like preventing or curing disease, if you will, helping to better the human condition and lessen the human predicament of injury, disease, insult, and perhaps even those changes that occur as a consequence of congenital issues or simply our own finitude and aging. What about something a little more gray zone? What about neuropreventive medicine? What does that mean? Nothing is wrong with the person. We're just going to prevent them from going down that slope of what? Inadequate cognition, differential emotionality, pain, suffering. And of course, if we're doing things preventively, there perhaps might be a thin line between what is preventive and what is boutique, or a little more colloquially, what is cosmetic. And now we're getting into the discourse between what constitutes treatment, what constitutes an enablement or a prevention, and what constitutes enhancement. And this becomes particularly a sticky wicket if the techniques and technologies we're using to define norm or abnorm, and those categories of what is normal or abnormal define what constitutes treatment or an enhancement, are the very same tools, or at least the same toolkit, that we're using to engage the interventions. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, even if all of these things are justifiable, viable, and perhaps good on some level, who's going to get the goodies? I mean, let's face it, although I said to you earlier that brain sciences are occurring multinationally, they're still the province of primarily developed countries. So what will that do to the relationships between developed, developing, and non-developed countries? If in fact we have this capabilization utilizing our neuroscience and technology, what does it do to the neurocapabilized haves and have-nots? And not only within those developed, developing, and non-developed country distinctions, but perhaps within our own developed countries. Who gets the goodies? I'm speaking to primarily a San Francisco audience, but I think ever more an audience that's more diversified. But I'm sure in each and every town, to those individuals who are tuning in and watching this either live or on podcast, you may have an area of town where there may be people who are homeless, who may be socioeconomically somewhat deprived. You think they're going to get these goodies? And what happens if they do? What happens to the new mean? In other words, what happens to those measures of central tendency as what is average now? And how will we take that? And how will we deal with it? Then there's that question of whether or not the brain space should even be conjoined. This is what the philosopher and cognitive scientist and attorney Nita Farahani has referred to as cognitive liberty. In other words, are we sort of going boldly where no one has gone before, and as a consequence, whence privacy? Even with these data, whence privacy? And then there are the contingencies for consent. How much do we really know? And if, in fact, we're using consent as part of the moral obligate for doing things rightly and goodly, whether it's research or whether it's intervention, treatment, whether it's preventive, whether it's enhancement or whatever, how much information do we have that we can provide to those individuals to allow them to consent? And are we going to maintain the contingencies to consent to say there is going to be or there's not going to be some continuity of research, and there is or there's not going to be some continuity of care? In other words, if you want to walk the wire and be today's neuronaut, to boldly go and boldly receive those things that very few have received before, are we going to put a net underneath you should you stumble and fall, or you on your own? And what does that mean then to be on your own? What does that do for the new normal? Do I have answers for these questions? No. But it's important to ask the questions, not in a way that is proscriptive and say we shouldn't go, because I'll tell you, in many cases, we won't know unless we go, until we go. We have to be prepared. This is what's called footfall effects. I'm not saying stand in one place for a couple of different reasons, not least of which is because the multinationality and relative globality of the brain sciences means that if we, whoever we may be, don't do something, it doesn't necessarily preclude someone else from doing it. Human urge, the technological imperative. We need to be prepared. Prepared for what? Prepared for the things that not only could go wrong, but that will go wrong, so that there are the mechanisms there to be able to recover, recuperate, perhaps forgive, and certainly not to repeat. A risk analysis and mitigation paradigm might work. Our research group has referred to that as Onramp, using the metaphor that the brain sciences and technology are like a Formula One speedway. Lots of lanes, high tech, many entries, high speed, big prizes. It can be dangerous too. The possibility of not only crashing, but what happens at speed. The ever more push for more speed, more technology. And what do we do with it? On-ramp. If you're going to get on that speedway, you need to have an operational neuroscientific and technologically risk assessment and mitigation paradigm. Asking key questions. Why are we developing the techniques and technologies? Who's going to get them? When are they going to get them? In what algorithm? Where will they get them? Which mechanisms are in place to provide ongoing research and care? And then what are the contingencies for consent? What are the consequences of doing the research? How will the consequences affect the character of not only individuals, but perhaps of society, of culture? What does that then mean, for example, for the various contexts of use? Do those contexts engage certain constraints and permissivities? And ultimately, those continuities of research and care, and not just research on the scientific side, but social science research, law, humanities research, to take a look not just at the idiosyncratic benefits, burdens, and risks, but the systemic benefits, burdens, and risks. Preparedness doesn't mean we shouldn't go. It simply means that we must dedicate equivalent efforts to those resources for ethical, legal, and social analysis on a multicultural level. Multicultural level. Our group has called for a cosmopolitan palette of developing neuroethics that can be locally usable. It took me all of 5 seconds to say that, but ladies and gentlemen, I got to tell you, that's a work in progress. Not easy to do. As we mentioned earlier, brain sciences foster billions of market share income for the countries that are involved, that are the share and stakeholders. And as a consequence, these must represent the economic ecology of the brain sciences, what is now called the neurobioeconomy. What does that mean for leveraging various capabilities, medically, socially, politically, biologically? This is what the French philosopher Michel Foucault referred to as biopower, and when rendered on a political scale, biopolitics. So it may call for a relatively new approach to neuroethics, one that recognizes that it must be certainly principled, and many of the existing principles are certainly valid enough, but are they sufficient? Do they satisfy? So are they satisfactorily sufficient, or might we need to revise some and create others anew? My research group tends to lean with the latter, that indeed some of these principles may need to be revised, if nothing else, to make them more multinationally, multiculturally competent, capable, sensitive, and responsive. And ultimately, what we need to understand is that the neurosciences are capable of creating power dynamics, hegemonies in a variety of different domains and disciplines. And understanding the economics and the ecologies will be ever more important to developing a functional ethics that is based upon certain duties, certain utilities, and then also communitarian ideas that are leveraged on a cosmopolitan stage that engage the agents in action. If I had more time with you, we could go further down the rabbit hole. And I could tell you some of the ideas of what that might entail and obtain, how we've looked, for example, as what's called a Rasherian framework of short, intermediate, and long-term goals, trying to apply what's called a Thagardian equilibrium, like a Rawlsian equilibrium. In other words, we may need to agree where to disagree and where certain areas of collaboration, cooperation, and competition can exist. The idea of coopetition, for example, utilizing perhaps Rawlsian dynamics of minimax, maximin, and having certain flexibilities, but still, that provides a relative ideal. If this is the toolkit we're going to use, we need to understand, like as in the mythology of old, these tools give us tremendous potential and promise. But there's also things that are problematic. This toolkit is equally a Pandora's box. We've opened it. It's going to be us to handle it. As I've said in many of my lectures before, it's an adage that my dad used to say to me when I was a little kid: measure twice, cut once. Well, but the thing is already out of the proverbial box. The box is open, and we must take good measure of not only the science and the technology, but in these ways, revisit the term technology itself. Literally, techne, logos. Tools plus logos. Rational accounting of their construction, their development, their intent, and those who build and use them. Such that the lens we have on the brain through the tools and techniques of neuroscience actually provides a mirror to look back upon ourselves. And in that way, maybe this field, neuroethics, might serve some metaethical import. Again, do I have answers? I do not. These answers are really the work of the forthcoming generation of multidisciplinary experts, ethicists, philosophers, humanists, sociologists, lawyers, teachers, artists, scientists, and more this will fall into the public realm. It's a challenge and it's an opportunity. And I hope that you found the past 35 minutes at least informative, interesting, and maybe even a little entertaining. And I apologize in retrospect for my thick New York City accent. I got out of the city 30 odd years ago, but unfortunately, you can't lose it, nor do I want to. I'm proud of it. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time. I thank you for your attention. And I'd like to open up the floor for any questions at this time.
Thank you so much. This was terrifying, but very, very good. Yeah. Wow, what a load of information. Thank you so much. I open the floor to questions. Whoever wants to speak first, unmute and go, or if you want, I can ask you the question and you write it in the chat box. Okay, I will break the ice while people are thinking of their questions. Do you think that they will take that in this process, humanists, as you mentioned before, will be taken seriously? I mean, I'm trying to. Things are moving fast, as you said, and they are moving in directions that are extremely important for the shape that humanity will have in the future. Do you really think that anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, artists, experts in this field will be taken seriously in their idea of the direction to be taken? Personally, I'm encountering difficulties.
Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, I think that one of the things that we could and I think should use the brain sciences for is to understand the basis of how we as humans think, as embodied humans that are embedded in culture. And as such, I think we need to understand that there are aspects of human cognition, there are aspects of human emotion, there are aspects of human behaviors within individual, inter-individual, communal, and even large-scale if you will, national orientations that crave certain things. They crave knowing certain things. They crave certain collectives that helps to explain, for example, formulation of organized religion. But it also helps to explain the need, if you will, for the human organism to be, if you will, a rational as well as social organism, and what that then means for our level of collaboration and our level of competition. So my hope is that by adding the neuro prefix to various disciplines, neuroanthropology, neurosurgery, it won't necessarily create, oh, well, this is the neurological thing and this is certainty, but rather it shines that light to say, what do we know and what do we not know about the brains of individuals who we're studying anthropologically, socially, philosophically, theologically? And what can that contemporary information about the human brain tell us about what humans are doing within that specific discipline and what it means? That's my hope.
Thank you. Alice, please, and then Mirko.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really inspiring. And I was thinking, I see in front of me two possible paths. On the one hand, we can think of the possibility of building machines that are going to lose moral dilemmas, moral problems for us. So the possibility of neuroscience is the basis for a technology which is going to take from us the burden the burden of decisions, of distribution, of justice, and so on. So machines that are algorithms that are able to decide for us. And on the other side, I got the impression from your talk that in a certain sense, neurosciences and neurotechnology is mirroring us back the problems and asking us to lose some fundamental problems, such as the problem of distributive justice. For example, you mentioned that the power dynamics and the economic dynamics that are hidden behind the neuroscientific research. And in a certain sense, neuroscience is asking us as philosophers or as intellectuals to solve these problems by going back to fundamental categories that we are thinking about since the beginning of philosophy. The possibility to live together. So my question is perhaps which one of these two paths, the one which is going in the direction of machines taking away from us the problem of deciding, and the other path, the question for moral decision given back to us. Which one of these one?
So let me answer your question with a question. Why do you see these as mutually exclusive? I don't.
Yeah, obviously this is a good.
So the idea, at least an ideal idea, and a real formulated construct to using the science and technology in the ways you've just described and that I alluded to, was to create cooperative networks of humans and machines, whereby the capabilities of the human are augmented by the capabilities of the machine, and vice versa. In other words, a machine system that's utilizing some form of massive data, coupled with some form of intermediate to soft, or perhaps even hard artificial intelligence, is used to compensate or delimit those gaps in human capabilities, whereby the ubiquity of information and its synthesis become problematic. And in return, in reciprocity, the human user is able to then delimit or essentially gap compensate those things that the machine system is not able to do well, or that we do not want to surrender to the machine system, or feel the machine system at least must have, if not a human in the loop, a human on the loop. So the reality of it is, what I see in the real world are human machine systems, neuro AI type systems, if you will, brain computer interfaces and large scale human machine interfaces that are based upon some form of reciprocal cooperativity that tend to delimit both parties simultaneously, and this way are not mutually exclusive. But like anything else, I think at the root of your question is, even given that paradigm for some form of cooperative, collaborative reciprocity and delimitation, what will we do with it? And what will it mean? So even what I would consider to be probably a relatively elegant solution to the question you asked, in the spirit of the philosopher and scientist Bruno Latour, answers one question only to generate others. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Mirko, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So a follow-up on this, and then my question, which is not a question, but it's more like a curiosity. So a follow-up on this is, I would like to know what's your take on sort of post-humanist, transhumanist perspective in philosophy. So from my understanding of what you just said, it seems that you think that, these collaborations between humans and robots, artificial intelligence, things, machines can bring about a lot of benefits for humanities. Yeah. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about this.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that it becomes very important to operationally define those two terms, transhumanism and posthumanism. Transhumanism, I think, has gotten considerably more traction, and we can take a look at some of the work coming out of the University of Oxford, and there are many, many good scholars there who have addressed that. We can take a look at some of the stellar work of my colleague, Professor Dr. Roland Benedicter of the Urac Center in Bolzano. So I think that the idea of transhumanism represents both a retrospective assessment and description of the trend of humanity in transition via the iterative use of its tools, as well as something prospective that will speculate upon what that might look like in the near, intermediate, and more distal future. I've worked with a very, very, very bright, at that time, graduate student, a stellar graduate student who's now received his doctorate and is a professional out on his own, primarily working in the area of political sociology and psychology, now named Dr. Dan Degerman. And what Dan was doing at the time that we were working together was revising, if you will, the transhumanist thesis to be more literal. In other words, looking at the human as a species in transition and what that then means for the process of transhumanism. In other words, the process of transition. At first, it was relatively passive, and then ever more it became far more active and now proactive, whereby humanity tends to want to engineer its own capabilities and its own evolution, and is doing so effectively through the use of a deeper understanding and the application of tools. So I think that the idea of transhumanism, when operationally defined, becomes far more a reality and a present reality rather than just a speculation for philosophical thought, and or perhaps even, if we look at some of the work of Zoltan Istvar, political thought, a political manifesto. Posthumanism, on the other hand, I think is still relatively ambiguous. One could take a look at sort of posthuman theses such as that advocated or at least described by the biologist and philosopher Donna Haraway. And I think what posthumanism evokes is an idea of what culture will be like if, in fact, humanity transcends some of its current standpoint dependencies and infestations. In other words, moving philosophically beyond the idea of the human as the center of whatever. In other words, sort of the if you will, core humanist and enlightenment idea, into something that's far more inclusive. Now, more recently, we're dealing with the ideas of panbiopsychism, and what does that mean as we understand the nature of how thought or cognition might be generated in organic systems, etc. And does that then decentralize the human in such a way to be far more integrated within, if you will, a larger network of potentially conscious and functional entities. That's one version of posthumanism. The other version of posthumanism is that of the, if you will, rise of the machine. And what essentially happens is that through our machinations, through this process of iterative machination, what Paolo Benanti refers to as iterative cyborgism, when we get beyond level 5 cyborgism, we actually utilize our machines to create something anew, and in creating something anew, that new organism or that new life force or that new system essentially displaces humanity as the primary system upon the planet. So I think both of those ideas, the transhuman idea literally, and post-humanistic ideas and concepts and speculations, do deserve some consideration, because I think they do represent potential futures. And in both cases, what becomes important to understand, once again, is the idea of techne and logos, that we, as humans, are the engineers of this trajectory of development, and therefore have a builder's responsibility, both in the short term and in the long. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, sure. I asked you this because I wanted to hear your take about the extended mind, which is related
well,
on that.
You should have just asked, what's my take on the extended mind? This is a very interesting thought. I mean, I don't want to monopolize others' time. I think that it would be really fun, for example, you and I could discuss that offline, because I think that some of these neurotechnological interfaces and these neurotechnological developments allow for certain dimensions of extensibility of the functions of cognitive systems like a brain, and therefore allow, I think, a broader precept of an extended mind as a concept, if not as a construct. So I think that's fascinating stuff. So we could talk about that offline if you'd like. I'd be pleased to.
Sure. And the actual question was another one. I think the way I got you is that you are calling for this sort of communitarian, cosmopolitan neuroethics. Yeah. So that's laudable in principle. I agree with that. But what do you think? How can we achieve that in such a world in which we live, such a divide?
Yeah, it's going to take hard work. No, you're absolutely right. As I said jokingly and a bit tongue in cheek, it took me 30 seconds to say it, but what's easy to say is not always easy to do. I think that it will, and I have experience, I can tell you, firsthand experience working at international fora, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, with the European Union and US brain projects. When you bring multinational groups together, I think that there are not only national interests, but cultural concerns that need to be preserved and I think need to be recognized and acknowledged, which is why the idea of that cosmopolitan communitarian ethic is one that has a particular dimensions of flexibility in it that would obligate that type of flexibility to be useful in more local situations and still be respective in more global situations. And that's why the idea of what we call the Thagard equilibrium might be very, very useful. But of course, what's the 800-pound gorillas in the room is the risk of devolving to simple ethical imperialism, what we say goes, or frank ethical relativism, in other words, laissez-faire ethics, when in Rome, do as the Romans. So I think it is certainly a work in progress, but I think that the worth at the end of the day will certainly justify the work.
Yeah, I think compromise is the right word there, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's not, yeah, I would agree, but I think, compromise tend to take on a derogatory implication. The actual term that is being used in the discourse is cooperative competition, whereby the parameters of cooperation are predicated on domains of competition so that they're creating mutually leverageable hegemonies that allow for this type of ecological and economic advancement within distinct cultural milieu. So I agree with you. I mean, that's absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you.
We have one more question from my student, Kyle. She's asking, so on the implementation of more advanced neurotechnology, I can't help but think about how such could exacerbate already present social and maybe economic inequalities. This gap is already present between those who have access to the sort of technology we use daily, who have good access, and those without access at all. With the implementation of more advanced neurotech, I can imagine this kind of gap being an issue if it wasn't already. Would it be too early to ask how we would cope with such a thing?
No, I don't think it's too early at all. I think it's appropriate to ask because, as I mentioned, and Kyle, your question it really digs deeply into one area of what I was discussing that I sort of glossed over for limitations of time. And that's the idea of who gets the goodies, who gets these things. I mean, on one hand, you would like to think that there's a commutative justice. In other words, there's equal distribution to all who need. But then you also have to define what is need. Who defines need? Do I define my needs or are my needs defined for me? In other words, how far should I go? What represents those things that I truly need and what represents those things that I desire? And this then has to understand also microeconomics as well as macroeconomics. And now once you get into that distribution, now you're truly into distributive justice. And I agree with you. There is the very strong risk, if not reality, that if you will, the neuro-capabilized haves, in other words, those who have access to these techniques and technologies, will become ever more, if you will, progressively involved with them. And that will broaden the schism that exists between those and those that have not. So the haves and the have-nots will grow wider in their distinction. Now, what can that do? Well, there's a number of things that can do. We can use these distinctions to define what is normal or what is not normal. And in those instances, we may then decide through some use of distributive justice that the abnorms need to be treated and therefore provide to those who don't have. However, what will tend to happen, as Susie just says, they do tend to grow somewhat homogeneously. So what you tend to see is reflective growth in both. And as a consequence, there's also the risk whereby provision actually means selection. And then you take on sort of the social import of now true biopower and biopolitics, where you have a privileged, or if you will, sort of elitist set of neurocapabilized haves, and you have a highly dependent, if not discriminated, group of non-capabilized neuro have-nots. It is something we certainly need to address now. And one of the things I can tell you, and I'm encouraged about, is that there have been multinational discourses that have taken a look at cultural distinctions, that have taken a look at international distinctions and things of distribution, provision, affordability of use, and also taken a look at intracultural and intranational distinctions of distributive justice. So I don't think it's too early at all. I think it's an excellent, excellent question.
Thank you so much. We have space for one last question if you want. We're right on time. I know that some of you have other classes or appointments in general. Well, thanks for working on it. I'm glad
Thank you.
that there are caring people asking questions and creating
and if you could please provide my email to the students. Feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to continue the discourse. This is the kind of thing, the more you think about it, the more questions you have. And I'm happy to continue the discourse, and I'd be happy to come back if you'd like.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your interest in my work. Ci vediamo. Allora, bye bye.
Ciao, buona giornata. Bye.